The Montana Territory, 1878. A woman steps off a stagecoach, her gloved hands clutching a letter promising a new life. She had crossed an ocean and a continent to marry a man she'd never met, only to find herself standing over his grave. Eleanor Parker had arrived too late. Her fiancé, cattle baron Thomas Reed, lay dead alongside his ranch hands, victims of a ruthless land grab that left nothing but blood-soaked earth and burning buildings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Most women would have turned back, boarded the next coach east, but Eleanor wasn't most women. As she stood amid the ashes of what should have been her future, something hardened within her. Thomas Reed's killers never considered one critical mistake in their brutal calculation. They left a witness, and they left her alive. This is the story of how a mail-order bride, with nothing but determination and a stolen ledger, built an empire from the ashes of Massacre, outmaneuvered the most dangerous men in the territory, and carved her name into the landscape with a vengeance that would echo through generations. The journey from Boston to Helena had taken Eleanor Parker nearly 3 weeks. 3 weeks of jarring carriages, choking train smoke, and the constant anxiety that gnawed at her stomach. At 32, Eleanor was what Boston society politely called a particular woman. Unmarried, educated, and with no prospects of securing a comfortable future after her father's investments had crumbled following the Panic of '73. The advertisement had been simple. Successful rancher seeks educated Eastern woman of good character for marriage. Must be practical, resilient, and willing to embrace frontier life. Passage paid. Thomas Reed's subsequent letters had been straightforward but kind, describing his cattle operation near Helena, Montana Territory, 15,000 acres, over 2,000 head of cattle, and a newly built 2-story house that awaited a woman's touch. Eleanor wasn't naive enough to believe in romantic fantasies. She needed security. He needed a wife. It was a pragmatic arrangement that offered her more dignity than remaining a burden on distant relatives who had made their reluctance to support her increasingly clear. The stagecoach driver had been unusually quiet as they approached the final leg of the journey, avoiding her eyes when she inquired about directions to the Reed property. "Ma'am," he'd finally said, removing his hat, "I think there's something you ought to know before we get much farther." The Reed Ranch, he told her, no longer existed. 2 weeks earlier, a group of armed men had ridden onto the property at dawn. Thomas Reed and 7 of his ranch hands were dead. The main house burned, the cattle scattered or stolen. The territorial marshal was investigating, but no arrests had been made. "I can take you straight to Helena instead," the driver offered, his weathered face showing uncharacteristic sympathy. "The Ladies' Aid Society there might—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady despite the shock washing through her. "Take me to the Reed property as planned." What remained of the ranch came into view as they crested a hill overlooking a vast valley. The blackened skeleton of what must have been the main house stood starkly against the dramatic backdrop of distant mountains. Several outbuildings appeared untouched, a barn, bunkhouse, and what looked like a storehouse. A small cluster of grave markers on a nearby rise told the rest of the story. Eleanor instructed the driver to wait as she walked to the fresh cemetery. 8 wooden crosses stood in a row, one slightly larger than the others, with Thomas Reed carved into its surface. She stood there, staring at the name of the man she had traveled so far to marry, feeling not grief exactly. She couldn't mourn someone she'd never met, but a profound sense of disorientation. "You Eleanor Parker." She turned to find a man watching her from several yards away, tall, lean, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. "Marshal Caleb Winters," he introduced himself, approaching with his hat in his hands. "When I heard Thomas Reed's mail-order bride was still coming, I figured I ought to be here. I'm truly sorry about what happened." "What exactly happened, Marshal?" Eleanor asked. Territory's changing, Winters replied. Big Eastern syndicate has been buying up land. Reed refused to sell, made himself some powerful enemies. He gestured toward a nearby ridge. They came at dawn. Most of the men never even got to their guns. Eleanor absorbed this, her eyes still fixed on Thomas Reed's grave. And no one has been arrested. Something in Winters' expression shifted. Evidence is circumstantial. The men responsible work for powerful people. I see, Eleanor said quietly. And what happens to the property now? Banks already foreclosing on the loans Reed took to expand last year. Without him or the cattle, there's no way to make the payments. Winters hesitated. Miss Parker, there's a twice-weekly coach back east. First one leaves tomorrow morning. I'd strongly advise you to be on it. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she surveyed the land stretching out before her, rolling grassland interrupted by patches of pine forest, a creek winding through the valley, mountains rising in the distance. This was supposed to be her home. I'd like to see his. House, she said finally. What's left of it? Winters looked like he might object, but instead nodded and led her down the hill toward the burned-out structure. As they approached, Eleanor could see that while the wooden portions had been consumed by fire, the stone foundation and chimney remained intact. Reed was proud of this place, Winters commented. Built it himself last year. Said he wanted something substantial for his bride. Inside the ruins, Eleanor moved carefully through the debris. Little remained beyond ash, charred wood, and scattered metal fixtures. In what must have been the study, a partially burned desk stood against one wall, its contents ransacked. "Marshal," she called, noticing something glinting beneath a fallen beam. "Could you help me move this?" Together they lifted the heavy timber, revealing a small metal lockbox, its exterior scorched but intact. Eleanor reached for it, but Winters' hand closed over hers. "That would be evidence, Miss Parker." Their eyes met, a silent challenge passing between them. "Evidence of what, exactly?" Eleanor asked. "You've made it quite clear no one will be arrested." "For these murders," Winters hesitated, then withdrew his hand. "I'll need to document anything you find." The box was locked, but Eleanor found a key in a hidden compartment beneath the desk drawer, exactly where Thomas had mentioned keeping valuables in one of his letters. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, several folded documents, and an envelope, addressed to Mrs. Thomas Reed. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated just 3 days before the attack. "Eleanor, by the time you read this, I hope to be greeting you in person at the station. If circumstances prevent that, this letter may serve as an introduction of sorts. Business in the territory has become complicated. I've enclosed documents that explain my concerns and the steps I've taken to protect our future. Trust Mr. Abernathy at the First Bank of Helena and Dr. Samuel Wilson in town. They have been loyal friends. The ledger contains names you should know, both allies and those who would do us harm. I look forward to building a life together. Yours, Thomas Reed." Eleanor carefully folded the letter and turned her attention to the ledger. Pages of meticulous notes, detailed cattle sales, land purchases, and dealings with various business associates. More importantly, several pages contained what appeared to be evidence of threats against Reed and suspicious activities by a company called Western Frontier Investments. "Miss Parker," Marshal Winters said, his voice now carrying an edge, "I need to take that ledger into evidence." Eleanor closed the book and met his gaze. "For your investigation, that will lead nowhere." "I don't think so, Marshal." This was addressed to Mrs. Thomas Reed. "As his intended bride, I have more right to it than anyone. That's not how the law works." "And how does the law work here, exactly?" Eleanor challenged. "You've already said the powerful people behind. This massacre won't face justice." A muscle twitches in Winters' jaw. "You don't understand how things are in the territory. Go home, Miss Parker. There's nothing for you here but danger. Eleanor slipped the ledger into her bag. I'm afraid Boston is no longer my home, Marshal. I'll be staying at the hotel in Helena while I consider my options. What options? Winters asked incredulously. The bank's taking everything. Reed's cattle operation is finished. Eleanor stood, brushing ash from her skirts. We'll see about that. The Palace Hotel in Helena was modest by Eastern standards but offered clean rooms and a respectable dining room. Eleanor took a corner table for dinner, the ledger and documents spread discreetly before her as she ate. Thomas Reed had been methodical in his record-keeping. The picture emerging from his notes was troubling but informative. Western Frontier Investments had been systematically acquiring ranches throughout the territory, using a combination of financial pressure, intimidation, and, when necessary, violence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Their ultimate goal appeared to be controlling the region's entire cattle industry before the arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which would make the land exponentially more valuable. A name appeared repeatedly in Reed's notes: Nathaniel Grant, Western Frontier's local representative. According to Reed's observations, Grant had orchestrated the ruin of at least 3 other ranchers who had refused to sell. Eleanor was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't notice the man approaching until he pulled out the chair across from her. Miss Parker, Samuel Wilson. I was a friend of Thomas Reed. The doctor was in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Eleanor recognized his name from Thomas's letter. Dr. Wilson, please join me. Wilson glanced at the ledger. I see you found Thomas's records. Yes, he mentioned you in a letter. Said you were someone I could trust. Wilson nodded solemnly. I treated his mother before she passed away last year. Thomas was a good man. What happened to him was murder, plain and simple, regardless of what the marshal says. Eleanor studied him carefully. Do you know who's responsible? Everyone knows. Nathaniel Grant and his employers at Western Frontier. But knowing and proving are different matters. Wilson leaned forward. Miss Parker, I don't mean to be indelicate, but what are your plans now? I'm not entirely sure, Eleanor admitted, but I don't intend to return east. The bank's moving to auction the Reed property next week. Without the cattle or means to work the land, I'm not sure what options. I have some money. Eleanor interrupted. Not much, but perhaps enough to secure a small parcel if the price is right. Wilson looked skeptical. These aren't good times for small operations. The big outfits are squeezing everyone out. Then perhaps it's time someone pushed back, Eleanor said quietly. Wilson studied her for a long moment. Thomas would have liked you, I think. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a card. Jacob Abernathy at First Bank, another friend of Thomas. Talk to him before you make any decisions. Eleanor found Abernathy at the bank the following morning. The banker was initially reserved but warmed considerably when she mentioned Dr. Wilson's recommendation and showed him Thomas's letter. Reed was one of the few honest men in the cattle business, Abernathy said, closing his office door for privacy. His death is a significant loss to this community. I understand the bank is foreclosing on his property, Eleanor said. Abernathy nodded uncomfortably. Unfortunately, yes. Thomas took out substantial loans last year to expand his herd. Without him or the cattle, my board has no choice. What if someone were to assume those loans? The banker looked at her with surprise. Miss Parker, we're talking about a considerable sum. I'm aware, but hypothetically, if I were interested in acquiring at least part of the property, what would that require? Abernathy leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. Hypothetically, you'd need to convince my board you have both the means and the knowledge to make the operation viable again, neither of which, forgive me, seems likely for a single woman from Boston. Eleanor reached into her bag and withdrew a small pouch, emptying its contents onto the desk. Jewelry, including her mother's diamond earrings and a pearl necklace, that had been in her family for generations. "This is what I have," she said matter-of-factly. "Not enough to buy the entire property, but perhaps enough to secure the homestead and some surrounding land. As for knowledge—" She opened Reed's ledger. "I've been studying Thomas's operation. With the right help, I believe I could revive at least a portion of it." Abernathy fingered the jewelry appraisingly. "These are quite valuable, but still insufficient for what you're proposing." "Then what would you suggest, Mr. Abernathy?" The banker considered for a moment. "There's a smaller parcel, about 500 acres, including the homestead site and good water access, that might be separated from the main property, with these items as collateral, plus a reasonable interest rate." He performed some quick calculations. "It might be possible. And the rest of Reed's land? Western Frontier will almost certainly acquire it," Abernathy said bluntly. "They've made their interest clear." Eleanor tapped the ledger thoughtfully. "What if I told you Thomas had evidence that Western Frontier has been engaging in illegal activities? That the accidents befalling uncooperative ranchers were orchestrated by Nathaniel Grant?" Abernathy's expression grew cautious. "I'd say that's dangerous knowledge, Miss Parker. Knowledge is only dangerous when it remains hidden." "Mr. Abernathy," Eleanor closed the ledger, "Thomas Reed was murdered because he stood alone. I intend to ensure that doesn't happen to others." The banker studied her for a long moment. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Parker." "Perhaps both," Eleanor acknowledged with a small smile. "Now, about that parcel of land." The following day, Eleanor met with a bewildered clerk at the land office to finalize her purchase of 500 acres of the former Reed property, including the burned homestead, the barn, and access to both the creek and the main road to Helena. The news spread quickly through town. The mail-order bride was staying, and she'd claimed a piece of Thomas Reed's land. By evening, her small room at the Palace Hotel had become an impromptu meeting place. Dr. Wilson arrived first, followed by two men he introduced as former Reed ranch hands who had been in Helena during the attack. "Frank Mitchell and James Cooper," Wilson said. "They've been looking for work since the massacre." The men removed their hats awkwardly as they entered. Mitchell, the older of the two, spoke first. "Dr. Wilson says you're planning to rebuild on Mr. Reed's land, ma'am." "A portion of it, yes," Eleanor confirmed, "and I'll need help." The men exchanged glances. "Begging your pardon, Miss Parker," Cooper said, "but do you know anything about ranching?" "Very little," Eleanor admitted candidly, "but I'm a quick learner, and I have Thomas's records. What I need are people who knew the operation and are willing to work with me to rebuild it." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just the work. Ma'am, the men who killed Mr. Reed, they won't take kindly to someone trying to revive what they tried to destroy. I'm counting on that, Mr. Mitchell." Eleanor opened the ledger to a page she had marked. "Thomas documented everything, the threats, the suspicious accidents, the names of those involved. What he lacked was allies. I don't intend to make the same mistake." She outlined her plan. Start small, with just enough cattle to establish a viable operation. Use Thomas's connections to secure contracts. Most importantly, gather evidence against Western Frontier and build alliances with other small ranchers facing similar pressure. "It won't be easy," she acknowledged. "The pay will be modest to start, and the danger is very real. But if we succeed, we'll be building something that matters, not just a ranch, but a stand against those who believe they can take whatever they want through violence and intimidation." The men were silent for a long moment. Finally, Mitchell spoke. "Mr. Reed was good to us, paid fair wages, treated us with respect. If you're willing to stand up to the men who killed him, then I'm with you, Miss Parker." Cooper nodded his agreement. "Me too. But you should know, There are others who might join. Men from ranches, western frontiers already taken. Good cowboys. With nowhere to go, Eleanor felt something like hope stirring for the first time since arriving in Montana. Find them, Mr. Cooper. Tell them what we're planning. As the men left to spread the word, Dr. Wilson remained behind. You've started something significant today, Eleanor, he said quietly. But you should know, Nathaniel Grant is in town. Word of your purchase will reach him by morning. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the frontier town that was to be her home now. Somewhere out there was the man who had ordered Thomas Reed's death, the man who thought nothing of destroying lives to build his empire. Good, she said simply. Let him come. The morning dawned crisp and clear as Eleanor surveyed the burned-out shell of what should have been her marital home. Frank Mitchell and James Cooper stood beside her, along with 5 other men who had answered their call, former hands from neighboring ranches that Western Frontier had systematically dismantled. We can salvage the stone foundation and chimney, Mitchell observed, kicking at a charred beam. Build around it. Might take a month with all of us working. Eleanor nodded, mentally calculating costs against her dwindling resources. The jewelry had secured the land, but rebuilding would require capital she didn't have. The bunkhouse is still intact, Cooper added. We can bunk there while we work. But Miss Parker, about your accommodations, I'll stay in the foreman's cabin. Eleanor interrupted, gesturing toward a small structure that had escaped the fire. It's weathertight and has a stove. The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. It's hardly suitable for a lady, Mitchell protested. I'm no longer a Boston lady, Mr. Mitchell. I'm a Montana rancher, Eleanor replied with finality. Now let's discuss our most pressing concern, cattle. According to Thomas's ledger, a portion of his herd, perhaps 300 head, had scattered into the hills during the attack rather than being stolen. If they could locate and round up even half that number, they'd have the beginnings of a viable operation. We'll need horses, said a weathered cowboy named Henry Dawson, and supplies for a proper roundup. Eleanor pulled out a list she'd prepared. Dr. Wilson has arranged credit at the general store for basic supplies, for horses. She hesitated, then made a decision. I'll speak with Mr. Abernathy about an additional loan. As the men dispersed to begin clearing debris, Eleanor sat on a fallen log and opened Thomas's ledger again. A name caught her eye, Michael Sullivan, owner of the neighboring Broken Wheel Ranch. According to the notes, Sullivan had been one of Thomas's few allies against Western Frontier, but his influence was limited due to gambling debts that had left his own operation vulnerable. Mr. Cooper, Eleanor called. How far is the Broken Wheel Ranch? About 2 hours' ride east, Cooper replied. Sullivan's place, decent man, bit of a gambler. Is he still operational? Cooper shrugged. Last I heard, Western Frontier's been circling, but Sullivan's holding on. Eleanor made a decision. I need to borrow a horse. The Broken Wheel Ranch stood in stark contrast to what remained of the Reed property. The main house was modest, but well-maintained. The corrals filled with cattle, bearing the distinctive Broken Wheel brand. As Eleanor rode into the yard, a man emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. That's far enough, he called. State your business. Michael Sullivan? Eleanor dismounted slowly. My name is Eleanor Parker. I've recently acquired part of Thomas Reed's property. Sullivan lowered his rifle slightly. Reed's mail-order bride? Heard you were headed back east? Evidently not, Eleanor replied dryly. May we speak privately? Sullivan's office was cluttered with papers, empty whiskey glasses and betting slips. The man himself was perhaps 40, with the weathered features of someone who spent most of his life outdoors and the bloodshot eyes of someone who spent too many nights with a bottle. So you bought part of Reed's spread, Sullivan said, pouring himself a drink without offering one to Eleanor. Either very brave or very foolish. So I've been told, Eleanor acknowledged. I'm here because Thomas's records indicate you were one of his few allies. Sullivan's expression hardened. Fat lot of good it did him, or me for that matter. He tossed a letter across the desk. Latest offer from Western Frontier, third one this month. Eleanor scanned the document, a thinly veiled threat disguised as a business proposal, offering to buy Sullivan's land at a fraction of its value. Have you considered accepting? She asked carefully. Sullivan laughed bitterly. Every damn day. But this land's been in my family since my father came west in '49. I'll be damned if I hand it over to those vultures. Eleanor leaned forward. What if there was a way to fight back? Not just hold on, but actually push back against Western Frontier? Sullivan's eyes narrowed. I'm listening. Eleanor outlined what she'd pieced together from Thomas's records, evidence of threats, sabotage, and violence orchestrated by Nathaniel Grant. Alone, it wasn't enough to bring legal action, but combined with testimony from other ranchers and additional documentation. You're talking about building a case, Sullivan said, suddenly looking more sober. Taking them to court? Eventually, Eleanor confirmed. But first, we need to survive. I have the land, but limited capital. You have cattle, but mounting debts. I'm proposing an alliance, Mr. Sullivan. The arrangement they negotiated was straightforward. Sullivan would provide 50 head of cattle and technical expertise in exchange for a 20% share of Eleanor's operation. More importantly, they would begin gathering evidence and reaching out to other remaining independent ranchers to form a coalition. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Sullivan walked her to her horse. Miss Parker, there's something you should know, he said quietly. Nathaniel Grant isn't just Western Frontier's agent. He's also Judge Montgomery's son-in-law. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. The territorial judge? Sullivan nodded grimly. The very same. Any legal case against Western Frontier will eventually land in his courtroom, and there's not a jury in the territory he couldn't influence. Eleanor absorbed this, understanding the implications. Their path just became significantly more difficult. Thank you for the warning, Mr. Sullivan. I'll see you next week with the contract. As she rode back toward her property, Eleanor noticed a cloud of dust in the distance, multiple riders approaching from the direction of Helena. She urged her horse into a grove of trees and watched as a group of 6 men rode past. At their head was a man whose tailored clothes and confident bearing marked him as different from his rough companions, Nathaniel Grant. Eleanor waited until they had passed before continuing, but her heart raced. Grant was making his move, sooner than she'd anticipated. By the time Eleanor reached the property, Grant and his men had already arrived. They formed a semicircle in front of the bunkhouse, where Mitchell, Cooper, and the others stood in wary defiance. "This is private property," Mitchell was saying as Eleanor rode up. "Miss Parker's property, legal and proper." Grant turned at her approach. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 35, with the polished appearance of someone who had never worked with his hands. "Ah, the famous Miss Parker," Grant said, offering an insincere smile. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Eleanor dismounted, keeping her expression neutral. "Mr. Grant, I presume. To what do I owe this visit?" "Just being neighborly," Grant replied. "I wanted to welcome you to the territory and express my condolences about your fiancé. Thomas Reed was persistent." The thinly veiled reference to Thomas's murder hung in the air between them. "Yes, Mr. Reed was known for his determination," Eleanor agreed calmly. "A quality I admired in him." Grant's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Parker, I'll be direct. You've purchased a small portion of land that, frankly, is of little use without the surrounding acreage. Western Frontier will be acquiring the remainder at auction next week. I'm prepared to offer you a generous sum, twice what you paid, to avoid any awkwardness." "That's very considerate, Mr. Grant." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. but I'm afraid I must decline. I didn't come all this way to turn a quick profit. Grant's expression hardened. You misunderstand me, Miss Parker. This isn't a negotiation. This territory is changing. Small operations can't survive. Perhaps, Eleanor acknowledged, but I intend to try nonetheless. Grant studied her for a long moment. They say you're in possession of some of Reed's papers, business records, correspondence, that sort of thing. Eleanor felt a chill, but maintained her composure. Mr. Reed's personal effects are no concern of yours, Mr. Grant. Everything concerning the Reed property is my concern, Grant replied, his voice dropping, especially certain allegations Reed may have documented, false allegations that could be damaging if misinterpreted. I imagine such allegations would indeed be troubling, Eleanor said carefully, particularly if they found their way to the territorial governor or federal authorities. Grant's face flushed with anger. You're making a serious mistake, Miss Parker. Judge Montgomery has already ruled on similar claims in the past. They were found to be without merit. Yes, I've heard about the judge's impartiality, Eleanor replied. But I wonder if it extends to his son-in-law's business practices. The flash of surprise in Grant's eyes confirmed Sullivan's information. You have 1 week to reconsider, Grant said, his voice now openly threatening. After that, circumstances here might become dangerous. As Grant and his men rode away, Mitchell approached Eleanor. Those were dangerous waters you just waded into, Miss Parker. We were already in dangerous waters, Mr. Mitchell, Eleanor replied, watching the retreating figures. The only difference is that now Mr. Grant knows it too. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Sullivan delivered the promised cattle, and the men began the arduous process of rebuilding. Eleanor divided her time between supervising construction and making discreet visits to other small ranches in the area. Some, like Sullivan, were cautiously receptive to her coalition. Others, broken by Western Frontier's tactics, merely wanted to sell and leave. By week's end, Eleanor had secured tentative agreements from 3 neighboring ranches to stand together against further encroachment. On the night before the land auction, Dr. Wilson arrived with unexpected news. Jacob Abernathy's been replaced. At the bank, he announced grimly. The board voted this morning. They've appointed William Harrison, Grant's former business partner. Eleanor absorbed this blow, understanding its implications. So Western Frontier now controls the bank. Wilson nodded. Harrison's first act was to review all outstanding loans. He's calling yours due immediately. That's impossible, Eleanor protested. The terms were clear. I have 6 months before the first payment. Harrison claims there was a clause allowing immediate recall under certain conditions, Wilson explained. It's fabricated, of course, but by the time you could challenge it legally, we'll have lost everything, Eleanor finished. She paced the small cabin, mind racing. When is payment due? Tomorrow morning, before the auction. Eleanor stopped. A plan forming. Dr. Wilson, I need you to send telegrams to everyone who's agreed to join our coalition. Tell them to meet here tomorrow at dawn, and I need to speak with Marshal Winters tonight. The Marshal was reluctant to see her, but Eleanor was persistent. When he finally agreed to meet at his office, his expression was guarded. Miss Parker, I don't have time for more accusations about Nathaniel Grant. This isn't about accusations, Marshal, Eleanor replied, placing a document on his desk. It's about this. Winters scanned the paper, a deed transfer for a small parcel of land adjacent to the Reed property. You're selling land to Sullivan? What does this have to do with me? I need you to witness and notarize the transfer tonight, Eleanor explained. Before Harrison can block it, Winters pushed the deed back toward her. Not my job, Miss Parker. The land office handles property transfers during business hours. And by business hours tomorrow, Western Frontier will have manipulated the bank. Into seizing my property, Eleanor countered. Marshal, I know you're not corrupt, just cautious. This is your chance to do something about the men who murdered Thomas Reed. Winters studied her for a long moment. What exactly are you planning? By dawn, Eleanor's small cabin was crowded with ranchers. Sullivan, two brothers named Taylor, who ran a small spread to the north, and Edward Barnes, whose family had been ranching in the territory since before the Civil War. Gentlemen, Eleanor began, spreading a map across the table. Western Frontier has used divide-and-conquer tactics to pick us off one by one. Today, that changes. She explained her strategy. Each of them would purchase specific parcels of the Reed property at auction, creating a patchwork of ownership that would prevent Western Frontier from controlling the whole. The notarized deed transfers Eleanor had prepared would then consolidate those parcels under a new entity, the Montana Cattlemen's Cooperative. With our combined resources, we can operate as a single unit while maintaining individual ownership, she concluded. United, we'll have enough leverage to secure fair contracts with the railroad when it arrives. Sullivan nodded appreciatively. Clever, Miss Parker, but Grant won't just stand by and watch. No, Eleanor agreed. He won't, which is why we need this to be completely legal and transparent. Marshal Winters has agreed to attend the auction as a neutral observer. The men looked skeptical, but Barnes spoke up. My father always said the only way to fight these land grabbers was to stand together. I'm in. The others nodded their agreement. One more thing, Eleanor added. I've sent copies of Thomas's evidence against Western Frontier to the Territorial Governor and the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver. If anything happens to any of us, that evidence becomes public immediately. The auction was held on the steps of the county courthouse in Helena. As expected, Nathaniel Grant arrived with several associates, including the newly appointed bank president, William Harrison. What he clearly didn't expect was the crowd of ranchers and townspeople who gathered to watch the proceedings. Grant approached Eleanor before the bidding began, his voice low and threatening. This is your last chance, Miss Parker. Take Harrison's offer and leave Montana. Eleanor smiled politely. Mr. Grant, I believe the bidding is about to begin. Shall we? The auction proceeded according to plan. Each time Western Frontier bid on a parcel, one of the coalition members countered with a slightly higher offer. Grant's frustration mounted visibly as parcel after parcel went to Eleanor's allies rather than his company. When the final lot was sold, a crucial water access point that went to Sullivan after a tense bidding war, Grant stormed over to the auctioneer, demanding to see the payment confirmations. These men don't have this kind of money, he insisted. Check their bank records. The auctioneer, visibly uncomfortable, gestured to Harrison. Mr. Harrison, can you confirm the funds? Harrison reluctantly nodded. The payments have cleared. What Grant didn't know was that Eleanor had liquidated her remaining assets and combined them with loans from her new partners to create a temporary pool of capital. The money had been deposited that morning, used to secure the parcels, and would be refunded once the deed transfers were processed. As Grant realized he'd been outmaneuvered, his composure finally broke. This is fraud. They're working together to manipulate the auction. Marshal Winters stepped forward. Is there a law against ranchers cooperating to purchase land, Mr. Grant? Because I wasn't aware of one. Grant's face flushed with rage. Judge Montgomery will hear about this. I'm counting on it, Eleanor replied calmly. In fact, I've already requested a meeting with the judge to discuss certain documents in my possession, including records of your threats against Thomas Reed before his murder. Grant's expression shifted from anger to something approaching fear. You're making a dangerous accusation, Miss Parker. Not yet, Eleanor corrected him. But I will be very publicly, unless Western Frontier agrees to cease its aggressive tactics against independent ranchers. The gathered crowd had grown silent, watching the confrontation with rapt attention. Grant lowered his voice. "This isn't over." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's just beginning." As Grant and his men departed, the coalition members gathered around Eleanor. "That was quite a performance," Sullivan said admiringly. "But Grant won't take this lying down." "No," Eleanor acknowledged. "He won't, which is why what we do next is crucial." The following week saw intense activity as the newly formed Montana Cattlemen's Cooperative began operations. The coalition members pooled resources to rebuild the main house on Eleanor's property, which would serve as their headquarters. Hands from all the member ranches worked together to round up scattered cattle and repair damaged infrastructure. Word of their stand against Western Frontier spread throughout the territory. 2 more small ranchers approached Eleanor about joining the cooperative, bringing additional land and cattle into the alliance. Dr. Wilson visited regularly, bringing news from town. "Grant's been summoned to Denver by his employers," he reported one evening. "Word is they're not pleased with his handling of the situation." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And Judge Montgomery recused himself from any cases involving Western Frontier," Wilson replied with a slight smile. "Apparently, he's concerned about the appearance of impropriety given his family connection." Eleanor allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. The tide was beginning to turn. As she stood on the porch of the newly rebuilt house, different from what Thomas had planned but solid and practical, Eleanor gazed out at the land that was slowly becoming home. In the distance, cowboys drove, cattle toward fresh pasture, the distinctive cooperative brand visible on their flanks. She opened Thomas's ledger, now worn from constant reference, and added a new entry. "Coalition secure, operations expanding, Western Frontier in retreat." For now, Eleanor had no illusions about the challenges ahead. Grant would return, possibly with new tactics. The railroad's arrival would bring fresh complications. Building a successful operation would require years of hard work and sacrifice. But looking out at what they'd accomplished in just a few short weeks, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Montana. Hope, not just for her own future, but for all those who refused to be pushed aside by men like Nathaniel Grant. The sun was setting over the mountains as Eleanor closed the ledger. In her mind, she could almost see Thomas Reed standing there, approving of what she'd built from the ashes of his dream. "We're not finished yet," she murmured, more to herself than to the ghost of her would-be husband. "But we've made a start." 3 months after the land auction, the Montana Cattlemen's Cooperative had transformed from a desperate gamble into a promising enterprise. The main house now served as both Eleanor's residence and the cooperative's headquarters, with a newly constructed office wing where she managed their growing operation. The autumn cattle drive had been successful, with the cooperative moving over 1,000 head to the railroad junction at Fort Benton, securing a favorable price that none of them could have negotiated individually. With winter approaching, the focus shifted to ensuring adequate feed and shelter for their combined herds. Eleanor stood at her office window, watching snow begin to dust the distant mountains. The door opened behind her as Frank Mitchell entered. Removing his hat, "Ma'am, riders coming in from the east pasture. Looks like Sullivan and Barnes." The 2 men arrived looking grim. Sullivan dismounted stiffly, his face tight with anger. "Someone cut our fence lines last night," he announced without preamble. "Found 20 head slaughtered near Cottonwood Creek." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Western Frontier?" "Can't prove it," Barnes said. "But 3 of Grant's men were seen drinking in Helena yesterday, boasting about teaching the cooperative a lesson." This was the first direct aggression since the auction. Eleanor had been expecting it, especially after news arrived that Nathaniel Grant had returned from Denver with renewed authority from his employers. "How bad is the damage?" she asked. "Fence can be repaired," Sullivan replied. "It's the message that concerns me. This is just the beginning." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Have all member ranches double their night patrols. No one rides alone. Mr. Mitchell, send word to Marshal Winters about the incident." As the men departed to carry out her instructions, Eleanor unlocked her desk drawer and removed Thomas's ledger. She'd been documenting every threat, every suspicious incident, building a case against Western Frontier. The slaughtered cattle would be added to the growing list. A knock at the door interrupted her writing. Dr. Wilson entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Eleanor, I came as soon as I heard about Sullivan's cattle." He placed his medical bag on a chair. "But that's not the only reason I'm here. There's news from Helena." Wilson handed her a newspaper. The headline announced the imminent arrival of Joshua Hayes, a federal judge dispatched from Washington to address growing concerns about land disputes in the territory. "Hayes has a reputation for being incorruptible," Wilson explained. "The governor requested him specifically after receiving complaints about Montgomery's conflicts of interest." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "When does he arrive?" "Next week. He'll be holding special hearings on land claims and allegations of intimidation." Wilson leaned forward. "This could be our opportunity, Eleanor. A chance to present your evidence to someone who might actually act on it." Eleanor considered this carefully. "Grant will do everything possible to discredit us before Hayes arrives." "Almost certainly," Wilson agreed, "which is why I brought something else." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope. "This arrived for you today. From the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver." Eleanor opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a brief letter acknowledging receipt of her evidence against Western Frontier and confirming that an investigator would be arriving in Helena concurrent with Judge Hayes's visit. "They're taking it seriously," she breathed, scanning the official letterhead. "It appears so," Wilson nodded. "But Eleanor, this makes you an even greater threat to Grant. The slaughtered cattle may just be the beginning." Eleanor placed the letter carefully in the ledger. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, Samuel, but it's the path we chose." The doctor studied her face. "You've changed since you arrived, Eleanor. Thomas would hardly recognize the businesswoman you've become. I hope he would approve," Eleanor said quietly. "I think he'd be quite impressed," Wilson replied, "and perhaps a bit intimidated." Despite increased vigilance, the attacks escalated over the following days. A barn on the Taylor brothers' property was burned. Water sources on Barnes's land were fouled. Cooperative riders reported being followed and threatened. Eleanor responded by consolidating their operations further. Cattle were moved to central pastures where they could be better protected. Families from outlying homesteads relocated temporarily to the main compound. The cooperative became not just a business alliance, but a community united against a common threat. 3 days before Judge Hayes's scheduled arrival, Eleanor was reviewing contracts in her office when Mitchell burst in without knocking. "Fire at Sullivan's place," he announced breathlessly. "Main house. They've got his family trapped inside." Eleanor was on her feet instantly. "Get every available man. Bring wagons, water barrels." By the time they reached the Broken Wheel Ranch, flames engulfed the entire western side of Sullivan's house. Sullivan himself was frantically organizing a bucket line from the well, his face streaked with soot. His wife and 2 children huddled nearby, coughing from smoke inhalation. "Michael," Eleanor called as she dismounted. "Is everyone out?" Sullivan nodded grimly. "Barely. They started it from outside, blocked the back door first." With the arrival of the cooperative forces, the fire was gradually brought under control, though not before it had destroyed nearly half the house. As the last embers were being doused, Sullivan pulled Eleanor aside. "Found this nailed to my barn door," he said, handing her a piece of paper. The message was brief. Judge Hayes won't save you. Sell now or burn. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Did you see who did this? No, but my oldest boy saw 3 riders heading north afterward. Sullivan's voice shook with barely controlled rage. Eleanor, I can't risk my family. If anything had happened to them— I understand, Eleanor said quietly. Take them to the main house. You'll all stay there until this is resolved. As they prepared to leave, Marshal Winters arrived, surveying the damage with a grim expression. This has gone too far, he said, approaching Eleanor. Even Grant should know better than to escalate to arson. Will you investigate? Eleanor challenged. Actually investigate this time? Winters had the decency to look ashamed. Hayes arrives tomorrow. Things are different now. Eleanor fixed him with a hard stare. Different enough for you to do your job, Marshal? As they returned to the cooperative headquarters, Eleanor made a decision. They couldn't wait for Hayes's formal hearing. They needed to act now, before Grant could escalate further. That evening, she convened the cooperative members in the main house dining room. The mood was somber as she laid out her plan. Tomorrow morning, I'll ride into Helena with all our evidence, she announced. I'll meet Judge Hayes as soon as he arrives and request an immediate hearing. Barnes shook his head. Grant's men will be watching the roads. You wouldn't make it halfway to town, which is why I'll need a diversion, Eleanor replied. Mr. Sullivan, you and the others will lead a highly visible cattle movement toward your northern pastures. Make it obvious. Draw attention. Meanwhile, I'll take the old mining trail through the eastern hills. Mitchell frowned. That trail's barely passable in good weather, let alone with snow coming in. It's our best option, Eleanor insisted. I'll leave before dawn. As the meeting broke up, Dr. Wilson remained behind. Eleanor, this is extremely dangerous. Let me take the evidence to Hayes. I can move through town without attracting attention. Eleanor shook her head. Hayes needs to hear this directly from me, Samuel. I'm the one with first-hand knowledge of how all these pieces fit together. Wilson studied her with concern. You know, when you first arrived, I thought you were just another Eastern woman who would flee at the first sign of trouble. I've never been more wrong about anyone. Eleanor smiled slightly. I had no idea who I would become when I stepped off that stagecoach. Sometimes I hardly recognize myself. Thomas chose well, Wilson said quietly, even if he never got to meet you. In the pre-dawn darkness, Eleanor prepared for the journey. She dressed practically in a split riding skirt and sturdy boots, with Thomas's ledger and all their collected evidence secured in a waterproof saddlebag. A small pistol, a gift from Sullivan after the auction, was tucked into her belt. Mitchell met her at the stable. I've saddled the bay gelding, sure-footed horse we have for that mountain trail. Eleanor nodded her thanks. Remember, the diversion needs to be convincing. Grant must believe all cooperative members are with the cattle. We'll make sure of it, Mitchell promised. Be careful, Miss Parker. The Eastern Trail was even more treacherous than Eleanor had anticipated. Disused for years, it twisted through rocky foothills before climbing sharply into the mountains that separated the cooperative's land from Helena. In places, the path narrowed to barely the width of her horse, with steep drops to one side. By mid-morning, snow began falling in earnest, reducing visibility and making the trail slippery. Eleanor pressed on, knowing delay meant giving Grant more time to act. She was traversing a particularly narrow section when the shot rang out. The bullet splintered rock inches from her head as her horse reared in panic. Eleanor clung to the saddle, fighting to control the frightened animal while scanning for the shooter. A second shot kicked up snow near the horse's hooves. This time, Eleanor spotted movement on a ridge to her left. A rider in a dark coat, rifle raised, spurring. Her horse forward, Eleanor abandoned the trail for a dense stand of pines, using the trees for cover as more shots followed. The horse stumbled on the rough terrain, but kept its footing as they plunged deeper into the forest. For nearly an hour, Eleanor navigated by instinct, keeping the morning sun to her right as she worked her way toward Helena. Every sound, a branch breaking, snow falling from trees, sent her heart racing, convinced her pursuer was closing in. When she finally emerged from the forest, the town of Helena was visible in the valley below. Eleanor allowed herself a moment of relief before noticing two riders on the main road, heading in her direction. Even at this distance, she recognized one as Nathaniel Grant. Staying within the tree line, Eleanor worked her way down toward town, avoiding the main approaches where Grant's men would surely be watching. By early afternoon, she'd reached the outskirts, where she stabled her exhausted horse at a livery operated by a man she recognized as a former Reed ranch hand. "Miss Parker?" The man looked startled. "You shouldn't be here. Grant's men are all over town. I need to reach the courthouse without being seen," Eleanor explained. "Judge Hayes arrives today." The stableman considered for a moment. "There's a service entrance through the alley behind Mason's Mercantile. Leads right to the back stairs of the courthouse. My boy can show you." The courthouse was bustling with activity when Eleanor arrived, slipping in through the service entrance as suggested. Attorneys, clerks, and citizens crowded the hallways, many discussing the imminent arrival of the federal judge. Eleanor found a secluded alcove near the main chamber and waited, the saddlebag containing their evidence clutched tightly against her. An hour passed, then another. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the town into a white landscape that would make returning to the cooperative impossible before morning. Finally, a commotion at the main entrance signaled Hayes's arrival. Eleanor watched as a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard entered, flanked by aides and territorial officials. This must be the federal judge. As Hayes was led toward a private chamber, Eleanor moved to intercept him. Before she could reach him, a hand gripped her arm, pulling her back. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Nathaniel Grant said, his voice low. "Judge Hayes has a very full schedule. He doesn't have time for hysterical women with wild accusations." Eleanor pulled her arm free. "Your intimidation tactics won't work here, Mr. Grant. Not anymore." Grant's smile was cold. "Miss Parker, you misunderstand the situation. I've just spent the past hour meeting with Judge Hayes, explaining the unfortunate misunderstandings that have arisen regarding Western Frontier's business practices." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. "Hayes wouldn't take your word over documented evidence." "Perhaps not," Grant conceded. "But he's a man who respects proper legal channels, unlike someone who would fabricate evidence and coerce witnesses to support a vendetta." Eleanor stared at him. "What have you done?" "Simply filed a formal complaint against the so-called Montana Cattlemen's Cooperative for conspiracy, fraud, and extortion." Grant's eyes gleamed with malice. "With sworn statements from several former associates of yours who have reconsidered their positions." "You threatened them," Eleanor realized. "Their families." Grant shrugged slightly. "People reconsider their options when presented with the full consequences of their choices. Sullivan, for instance, has provided a very detailed statement about how you manipulated him into joining your scheme." Eleanor felt as though she'd been struck. "You're lying. Michael would never—" "See for yourself," Grant interrupted, withdrawing a document from his coat. His signature properly witnessed, along with Barnes and both Taylor brothers. The document was genuine, a formal statement withdrawing all claims against Western Frontier and dissolving the cooperative agreement. All four signatures appeared authentic. "Judge Hayes has reviewed these statements," Grant continued. "He's understandably skeptical about any evidence you might present given the circumstances." Eleanor fought to maintain her composure. This changes nothing. The truth is in these documents, regardless of who supports it now. Ah, yes, your precious evidence. Grant's expression hardened. Unfortunate about the fire at the cooperative headquarters this morning. I understand very little survived. Eleanor froze. What are you talking about? You hadn't heard. A terrible accident. Faulty stove, they say. Grant's voice dripped with false sympathy. Thankfully, most residents had evacuated to town after Sullivan's change of heart. Marshal Winters is investigating, of course, but these things happen in frontier territories. The implications struck Eleanor like a physical blow. The headquarters destroyed. The cooperative members, scattered or coerced into submission, all their work undone in a single day. You won't get away with this, she said, her voice hardly more than a whisper. I already have, Miss Parker. Grant leaned closer. Judge, Hayes is a reasonable man, but he has no patience for those who waste the court's time with fabricated claims. I suggest you leave Helena before he issues a warrant for your arrest on charges of perjury and fraud. As Grant walked away, Eleanor stood motionless, the saddlebag suddenly heavy in her hands. Everything they had built was crumbling, and her allies had abandoned her, willingly or otherwise. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Eleanor considered defeat. Perhaps it had been foolish to believe she could stand against men like Grant, with their money and influence. Perhaps she should take what little she had left and return east. The thought had barely formed when she remembered Thomas Reed's grave on that lonely hillside. He had refused to surrender, even knowing the Sioux's risks. She had come to Montana as his bride, but she had stayed to fight for something larger than herself. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and moved purposefully toward Judge Hayes's chamber. Grant might have poisoned the well, but she still had the truth, documented in Thomas's meticulous records and supplemented by her own observations. If Hayes was truly the incorruptible jurist Wilson had described, he would at least listen. The clerk outside Hayes's door attempted to block her entry, but Eleanor fixed him with such a determined stare that he hesitated just long enough for her to step past him. Judge Hayes looked up from his desk with surprise as she entered. Your Honor, my name is Eleanor Parker. You've already heard Nathaniel Grant's version of events. I request 5 minutes to present another perspective. Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded to his clerk. 5 minutes, Miss Parker, then I'll have you removed if necessary. Eleanor placed Thomas's ledger on the desk. This belonged to Thomas Reed, a rancher murdered 3 months ago after refusing to sell his land to Western Frontier Investments. I was to be his wife. Instead, I became the keeper of his records, including evidence of systematic intimidation, violence and fraud perpetrated by Nathaniel Grant. Hayes made no move to open the ledger. Mr. Grant has informed me that you've been coercing local ranchers into making false claims against his company. Has he told you how those ranchers suddenly changed their statements? Eleanor countered. Or about the fire at Sullivan's ranch 3 days ago, or the one at our headquarters this morning. A flicker of interest crossed Hayes's face. Go on. For the next 5 minutes, Eleanor presented the essence of their case against Western Frontier, the pattern of threats, suspicious accidents, and finally outright violence that had characterized Grant's campaign to control the territory's ranching industry. Sullivan and the others withdrew their statements because Grant threatened their families, she concluded. But the evidence exists independently of their testimony. I ask only that you review it before dismissing our claims. Hayes was silent for a moment, then reached for the ledger. I'll examine this tonight, Miss Parker. That's all I can promise. Thank you, Your Honor. I've taken enough of your time. Eleanor turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. A federal investigator from the U.S. Marshal's Office should be arriving today, sent from Denver, specifically to look into these matters. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Indeed, no one has mentioned this to me. I suspect Mr. Grant has been working to intercept him, Eleanor replied, just as he tried to prevent me from reaching you today. As Eleanor exited the chamber, she nearly collided with Dr. Wilson, who was arguing with the clerk. "Eleanor!" Wilson exclaimed. "Thank God. When we heard about the fire—" "It's true then?" Eleanor asked, her heart sinking. "The headquarters is gone," Wilson nodded grimly. "Burned to the ground. But that's not the worst of it. Sullivan and the others signed papers dissolving the cooperative." "I know," Eleanor replied. "Grant showed me. Did they have a choice?" "Western frontier men took Sullivan's children for safekeeping during the confusion after the fire," Wilson explained in a low voice. "The others faced similar threats. They're not cowards, Eleanor." "I never thought they were," she said quietly. "Where is everyone now?" "Scattered. Some in town, others headed back to their individual properties to salvage what they can." Wilson hesitated. "There's something else. The U.S. Marshal investigator arrived this afternoon." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "Did you speak with him?" "Briefly, before Grant's men surrounded him," Wilson replied. "He's at the Grand Hotel under what amounts to house arrest, supposedly for his protection while traveling in the territory." Eleanor considered this new information. "Judge Hayes has Thomas's ledger. He's promised to review it tonight. If the investigator could corroborate, it would strengthen our case considerably," Wilson agreed. "But how do we reach him with Grant's men watching?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "The same way I reached the courthouse, through back channels and with help from people Grant doesn't control." As they stepped into the snowy street, Eleanor noticed Marshal Winters watching from across the way, his expression unreadable. For a moment their eyes met, and Eleanor wondered which side he would choose when the final confrontation came. Night was falling over Helena as Eleanor and Wilson formulated their plan. The outcome remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the battle for Thomas Reed's legacy and for the future of the territory's independent ranchers had reached its decisive moment. The Grand Hotel stood 3 stories tall on Helena's Main Street, its windows glowing warmly against the winter night. 2 men lounged in chairs on the front porch, despite the cold, their attention focused on the hotel entrance. More of Grant's men, undoubtedly, watching for anyone attempting to reach the federal investigator, Eleanor and Dr. Wilson observed from the shadows of an alleyway across the street. "Front covered," Wilson murmured. "Back entrance too, I'd wager." "Then, we don't use the entrances," Eleanor replied, her eyes moving to the fire escape on the building's eastern side. "Do you know which room he's in?" "Second floor, east corner," Wilson confirmed. "Room 212. Eleanor considered their options. "We need a distraction. Something to draw Grant's men away from their posts, even briefly," Wilson thought for a moment. "The saloon next door. Most of Grant's men drink there. If there was a fight, a big one—" "Can you arrange that?" Eleanor asked. Wilson smiled slightly. "There are several cooperative sympathizers drowning their sorrows tonight. I believe they could be persuaded to express their frustrations physically." While Wilson slipped into the saloon, Eleanor circled the block, finding a position that would allow her quick access to the fire escape once the distraction began. The snow had stopped, but the temperature was dropping rapidly, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. She didn't have to wait long. A tremendous crash erupted from the saloon, followed by shouting and the unmistakable sounds of a brawl spilling out into the street. As she'd hoped, Grant's men abandoned their posts to investigate the disturbance. Eleanor moved quickly, scrambling up the icy fire escape with nimble determination. Reaching the second floor, she peered through windows until she found room 212. A man sat at a small desk inside, reviewing documents by lamplight. She tapped gently on the glass. The man looked up sharply, his hand moving instinctively to a holster at his side. When he saw Eleanor, surprise registered on his face. He approached cautiously and unlocked the window. Deputy U.S. Marshal Lawrence Reynolds, he introduced himself, as Eleanor climbed through. And you must be Eleanor Parker. How did you know? Eleanor asked, brushing snow from her skirt. Your description was in the file sent from Denver, Reynolds explained, though they failed to mention your penchant for unconventional entrances. Despite the gravity of their situation, Eleanor found herself smiling. Circumstances have required adaptation, Marshal. I understand you've been detained. Reynolds nodded grimly. Politely, but firmly. Mr. Grant's associates have made it clear that the territory is too dangerous for me to move about freely. Judge Hayes has Thomas Reed's evidence, Eleanor explained quickly, but Grant has poisoned the well, coerced our witnesses into recanting. Your corroboration could make the difference. Reynolds gestured toward his documents. I've spent weeks building a case against Western Frontiers operations throughout the territory. Land fraud, intimidation, even suspected murder. But without local testimony, the cooperative members withdrew their statements under duress, Eleanor insisted. Their families were threatened. I believe you, Reynolds assured her. But Hayes will need more than just your word against Grant's. Eleanor paced the small room, mind racing. Marshal, Winters knows the truth, even if he's been reluctant to act on it. And there must be others in town with knowledge of Western Frontiers methods, people who've observed but remain silent out of fear. Find me those witnesses, Reynolds said, and I can present a federal case that even Judge Montgomery couldn't dismiss. But we need to move quickly. Grant knows I'm here, which means he'll accelerate whatever plans he set in motion. The commotion from the street had subsided, which meant Grant's men would soon return to their posts. I need to go, Eleanor said, moving toward the window. Can you meet Judge Hayes tomorrow morning? Reynolds frowned. Not if Grant's men have any say in the matter. They won't, Eleanor promised. Be ready at 9 o'clock. Someone will come for you. As Eleanor prepared to descend the fire escape, Reynolds caught her arm. Miss Parker, be careful. Men like Grant don't lose gracefully. When they sense defeat, they become most dangerous. Eleanor nodded, the warning echoing her own concerns. Neither do I, Marshal Reynolds, neither do I. The snow had begun again as Eleanor made her way through Helena's back streets toward the small boarding house where she'd secured a room. Her mind worked, furiously, piecing together a plan for the morning. They needed witnesses, people willing to testify about Western Frontiers methods despite the risks. A shadow detached itself from a doorway ahead. Eleanor tensed, her hand moving to the pistol in her belt. Miss Parker. Marshal Winters stepped into the dim light of a street lamp. Bit late for a stroll, Eleanor regarded him warily. Following me, Marshal. Just happened to notice you climbing down from the Grand Hotel like a cat burglar, Winters replied dryly. Thought I should investigate. Are you planning to arrest me? Eleanor challenged. Winters sighed heavily. No, Miss Parker. Though God knows you don't make it easy to keep the peace in this town. Eleanor studied his face, trying to read his intentions. Whose peace are you keeping, Marshal? The territory's or Nathaniel Grant's? Something shifted in Winters' expression. I've walked a fine line since coming to this territory, sometimes too fine. And now? Eleanor pressed. Winters glanced around to ensure they were alone. I heard about the fire at the cooperative headquarters and about Sullivan and the others withdrawing their statements. They had no choice, Eleanor said. Grant threatened their families. I believe you, Winters said quietly. I've turned a blind eye to too much already. What Grant did to Reed, what he's done since. It can't continue. Hope flared in Eleanor's chest, but she tempered it with caution. Pretty words, Marshal. But I need more than that, Winters nodded, understanding her skepticism. Deputy Marshal Reynolds is effectively under house arrest. Judge Hayes is reviewing evidence that Grant has already worked to discredit. You need something to tip the scales. Or someone, Eleanor suggested, watching him carefully. Winters met her gaze steadily. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, Judge. Hayes's chambers. I'll be there with sworn statements from 3 of my deputies regarding incidents they've witnessed involving Western Frontier operations. Eleanor couldn't conceal her surprise. Your deputies? They'll testify against Grant? Not all law enforcement in this territory is corrupt, Miss Parker, Winters said with a hint of pride. Just cautious. Sometimes too cautious. As they parted ways, Eleanor felt the first genuine optimism since learning about the cooperative's dissolution. With Winters' testimony, Reynolds' federal investigation, and Thomas's evidence, they might actually prevail against Western Frontier. But Grant had proven himself ruthless and resourceful. The night was far from over, and morning still hours away. Eleanor had just reached the boarding house when she noticed the door standing slightly ajar. Drawing her pistol, she approached cautiously. Inside, the small front parlor was in disarray. Furniture overturned, her belongings scattered, looking for these. Nathaniel Grant stepped from the shadows, holding up Eleanor's saddlebags, the ones containing copies of Thomas's evidence and her own documentation. Eleanor aimed her pistol steadily. Put those down, Grant. Or what? You'll shoot me in cold. Blood? Grant seemed unconcerned by the weapon. That would rather undermine your claim to the moral high ground, wouldn't it? What do you want? Eleanor demanded, keeping the gun trained on him. Grant set the saddlebags down, but kept his hand resting on them. The same thing I've always wanted. Cooperation. This territory is changing, Miss Parker. The old ways, independent ranches, small holdings, they're finished. Progress demands consolidation, efficiency. You call murder progress? Eleanor's voice was sharp with contempt. I call it inevitable, Grant countered. Reed refused to see that. He chose the hard way. You don't have to make the same mistake. What are you offering? Eleanor asked, buying time as she assessed her options. Grant smiled thinly. A partnership. Western Frontier could use someone with your determination. You've proven yourself quite capable, despite the unfortunate circumstances. Join us, and you can help shape how this territory develops. And if I refuse, then you'll lose everything, just as Reed did. Grant's smile vanished. Judge Hayes is a reasonable man, but even he requires evidence. Evidence that will no longer exist by morning. Eleanor tightened her grip on the pistol. You're not leaving with those saddlebags. Oh, I don't need to take them, Grant replied casually. My men are currently visiting Dr. Wilson, Marshal Reynolds, and anyone else who might. Support your claims tomorrow. By dawn, there will be no witnesses, no evidence, and no case against Western Frontier. Cold fear gripped Eleanor. If you harm them... That depends entirely on you, Miss Parker, Grant interrupted. Drop the gun, agree to my terms, and everyone. Lives. Continue this futile crusade, and the consequences are on your head. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was their breathing. Eleanor's mind raced through alternatives, calculating risks and potential outcomes. Finally, she lowered the pistol. You win, Grant. I'll sign whatever you want. Grant's smile returned, triumphant. A wise decision. I knew beneath all that righteous determination was a practical woman. As he reached into his coat for papers, Eleanor made her move. In one fluid motion, she kicked over a small table between them and lunged forward, snatching the saddlebags while Grant was momentarily distracted. Grant recovered quickly, grabbing her arm. Enough games, Miss Parker. They struggled briefly before Eleanor wrenched free, stumbling backward. Grant advanced, his face contorted with anger, until the sound of a cocking pistol froze him in place. Marshal Winters stood in the doorway. his weapon aimed squarely at Grant's chest. Behind him were two deputies. "That's far enough, Nathaniel," Winters said calmly. Grant's expression shifted from rage to calculated charm. "Marshal, this is a simple misunderstanding between business associates. Nothing that requires your intervention." "Heard everything, Grant," Winters replied, "including your threats against Dr. Wilson and Marshal Reynolds. That's interfering with a federal investigation, a serious offense." "You're making a mistake, Winters," Grant warned. "Judge Montgomery isn't here." Winters finished for him. "And frankly, I'm more concerned about what Judge Hayes will say when he hears about your activities tonight." As the deputies moved to take Grant into custody, he made one final appeal to Eleanor. "This changes nothing. Western Frontier is bigger than me. The company will send someone else, and the outcome will be the same." Eleanor retrieved her saddlebags, meeting his gaze steadily. "Perhaps, but you won't be here to see it." Dawn brought a clear sky and bitter cold. Eleanor had spent the night at the marshal's office, helping prepare the case against Grant. Runners had been dispatched to ensure Dr. Wilson's safety and to secure Marshal Reynolds' presence at the morning meeting with Judge Hayes. Sullivan arrived as they were gathering their materials, his face haggard from lack of sleep. "Eleanor," he began awkwardly, "I came as soon as I heard about Grant's arrest. My children are safe," Eleanor assured him. "Marshal Winters sent deputies to all cooperative members' families last night." Sullivan's relief was palpable. "The papers I signed. I never would have—" "I know," Eleanor interrupted gently. "None of us could have anticipated Grant's methods." "What happens now?" Sullivan asked. "The cooperative headquarters is gone. Most members have scattered." Eleanor considered the question. "We rebuilt again. But first, we ensure Grant and Western Frontier face consequences for their actions." Judge Hayes's chambers were crowded that morning. Eleanor, Reynolds, and Winters presented their evidence methodically: Thomas's ledger, Eleanor's documentation, the federal investigation findings, and sworn statements from Winters's deputies regarding Western Frontier's intimidation tactics. Hayes listened attentively, asking pointed questions that revealed a sharp legal mind. When the presentations concluded, he sat in silence for several moments, reviewing key documents. "This is compelling evidence of systematic illegal activity," he finally stated. "I'll issue warrants for Mr. Grant on multiple charges, including conspiracy, intimidation, and as an accessory to the murder of Thomas Reed and his men." Eleanor felt a profound sense of vindication, for Thomas, for herself, and for all who had suffered under Grant's tactics. "What about Western Frontier itself?" Reynolds asked. "Grant was acting as their agent." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "I'll send a formal recommendation to the Department of Justice for further investigation into the company's practices throughout the territory. In the meantime, all Western Frontier land acquisitions in this jurisdiction will be suspended pending review." As they exited the courthouse, Eleanor found herself walking alongside Marshal Winters. "What made you change your mind?" she asked quietly. "About Grant, about helping us?" Winters was silent for a moment before responding. "When Reed was killed, I knew who was responsible. But taking action seemed complicated, dangerous. I told myself I was being prudent, waiting for the right time." He shook his head. "Then you arrived, a woman alone, with every reason to flee back east. Instead, you stayed and fought. Made me realize that waiting for the right time was just cowardice." Eleanor offered her hand. "Thank you, Marshal, for finding your courage when it mattered most." The next weeks passed in a flurry of activity. With Grant in custody awaiting trial and Western Frontier's operations suspended, the cooperative members gradually returned, reclaiming their properties and rebuilding what had been destroyed. The headquarters rose again on Eleanor's land, not as grand as before, but sturdy and functional. Cattle operations resumed as winter gave way to spring, with new calves dotting the hillsides. One bright April morning, Eleanor rode out to the small cemetery where Thomas Reed was buried. She had visited periodically since her arrival, but this visit felt different. The grass was beginning to green around the grave markers, and wildflowers pushed through the soil that had been frozen for so long. Eleanor dismounted, approaching Thomas's grave with a leather-bound ledger in her hands. Not his original, which remained in evidence, but a new one she had started when rebuilding the cooperative. "I thought you should know," she said softly, addressing the wooden cross. "The cooperative is thriving. We've expanded to 8-member ranches now, with more considering joining. The railroad has agreed to our terms for cattle shipments this fall." She smiled slightly. They found our united front quite persuasive. A gentle breeze stirred the new grass as Eleanor continued her one-sided conversation. "Grant's trial begins next month. Judge Hayes is presiding. The evidence is overwhelming. I don't expect he'll see freedom again." She paused, her fingers tracing the edges of the ledger. "Western Frontier is facing federal charges as well. Their operations throughout the territory have been suspended." Eleanor knelt, placing a small bunch of wildflowers against the cross. "I never knew you, Thomas Reed. We exchanged letters, made plans, but were strangers to each other. Yet somehow you've shaped my life more profoundly than anyone I've ever known." She touched the wooden marker gently. "I came here as your bride, but I've become something else entirely. Something I never imagined possible." As she stood to leave, Eleanor noticed Marshal Winters approaching on horseback. He dismounted and removed his hat respectfully as he joined her by the grave. "Sorry to intrude," he said quietly. "Word just came from Denver. The territorial governor has approved our petition." Eleanor's heart quickened. "All of it?" Winters nodded. "The entire valley, from the eastern foothills to the western ridge, will be designated as protected rangeland. No single entity can own more than 20%. The cooperative's model is officially recognized. This was the final piece of their strategy, not just defeating Grant or Western Frontier, but establishing a new framework that would prevent similar land grabs in the future. A framework that would preserve the independence of small ranchers while allowing them the benefits of cooperation. "Reed Valley," Eleanor murmured, testing the name they had proposed for the newly protected region. "Thomas would have approved, I think." Winters glanced at the grave. "From what I've heard of him, he would have been proud. Of the valley, and of you." As they rode back toward the cooperative headquarters, Eleanor surveyed the land stretching out before them, the same view that had greeted her on that first day when she stood among the ashes of what should have been her future. Now it represented something far greater than one ranch, one dream, or even one woman's determination. Reed Valley would stand as a monument not just to Thomas Reed, but to all who had fought to preserve a way of life against those who would destroy it for profit. The cattleman's empire Eleanor had rebuilt from the ruins would endure, a testimony to what could be accomplished when people stood together against seemingly insurmountable odds. The headquarters came into view as they crested a hill, the new main house, barns, corrals, and bunkhouses bustling with activity. A home, not just for Eleanor, but for all who had joined her cause. "What's next, Miss Parker?" Winters asked as they paused to take in the scene. Eleanor smiled, the confident expression of a woman who had found her true purpose. "We expand. The railroad's coming, the territory's growing. There's an opportunity for those willing to work together rather than destroy each other." "And you'll lead them," Winters observed. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the future she could now envision clearly. "I came to Montana to be a wife. Instead, I found an empire waiting to be built." As they rode down toward the headquarters, Eleanor felt Thomas Reed's presence, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a catalyst that had set her on this unexpected path. She had arrived too late to be his bride, but perhaps that had been destiny's design all along. The mail-order bride had found her promised husband dead in a massacre, and in response, she had rebuilt his dreams into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. 5 years passed, transforming both the landscape and the woman who had shaped it. Reed Valley flourished under the cooperative's stewardship, becoming a model that other regions throughout the territory began to emulate. The Northern Pacific. Railroad's arrival had brought the anticipated boom in cattle prices, and the cooperative's unified bargaining position had secured advantageous contracts that individual ranchers could never have obtained. Eleanor Parker, once known simply as Reed's mail-order bride, was now one of the most influential figures in Montana Territory. The main house had been expanded into a proper headquarters befitting the operation's success, with a dedicated office wing where Eleanor conducted the cooperative's increasingly complex business affairs. On a warm summer morning, Eleanor sat at her desk reviewing quarterly reports when a knock interrupted her concentration. Frank Mitchell, now the cooperative's operations manager, entered with an expression that immediately put Eleanor on alert. "Rider from Helena," Mitchell announced. "Western Frontier's back." Eleanor set down her pen. "I thought their assets in the territory were permanently frozen after the federal case." "Different name, same investors," Mitchell explained, "calling themselves Montana Development Corporation now. They've purchased the old Clark property just north of Reed Valley." Eleanor frowned. The Clark Ranch had been one of the few holdouts against joining the cooperative, despite multiple overtures. Old Man Clark had died the previous winter, and his son had apparently wasted no time in selling. "Who's running the operation?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. "William Harrison," Mitchell confirmed, "former bank president who worked with Grant." Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the valley that bore Thomas Reed's name. Western Frontier's return was concerning but not unexpected. The company had resources and connections that extended far beyond Montana. Even with Nathaniel Grant imprisoned for his crimes, it was naive to think they would abandon their territorial ambitions permanently. "Have they made any moves against cooperative members?" she asked. Mitchell shook his head. "Not yet. But Harrison's been meeting with ranchers along the northern boundary, offering premium prices for their land." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "They're trying to establish a foothold, create pressure from outside Reed Valley's protected status." "What do we do?" Mitchell asked, his weathered face showing concern. Eleanor returned to her desk, her decision already forming. "Call a meeting of all cooperative members for tomorrow and send word to Marshal Winters. I want to know everything about this Montana Development Corporation." As Mitchell left to carry out her instructions, Eleanor unlocked a drawer and removed a familiar leather-bound ledger, Thomas's original, returned after Grant's conviction. Its pages were worn from constant reference, a tangible link to the man whose legacy she had built upon. The tactics would be different this time, Eleanor knew. After the public spectacle of Grant's trial and Western Frontier's disgrace, their new incarnation would operate with more subtlety. No midnight raids or burned homesteads. Instead, they would use financial pressure, political influence, and the inexorable logic of progress to achieve their aims. The cooperative meeting the following day was well attended, with representatives from all 12-member ranches filling the conference room Eleanor had added to the headquarters last year. Montana Development Corporation is Western Frontier with a new face, Eleanor began, addressing the assembled ranchers. Their goal remains the same, controlling as much land as possible before statehood, when property values will inevitably rise. Michael Sullivan, now serving as the cooperative's treasurer, spoke up. "They can't touch Reed Valley. The territorial protection is solid." "But they can surround us," Eleanor countered. "Cut off expansion, pressure ranchers outside our boundaries, and eventually strangle our operations through control of water rights and transit routes." Edward Barnes, the oldest of the cooperative members, cleared his throat. "What exactly are you proposing, Eleanor? We can't stop people from selling their land if they're of a mind to." Eleanor unrolled a map across the table. "We expand the cooperative's reach, not just Reed Valley, but north toward the Clark property and east along the river. We offer competitive prices, favorable terms for those who join us." "That's ambitious," Sullivan observed. "Do we have the capital?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "The railroad contract renegotiation last month was more favorable than I let on. We have reserves." The discussion continued for hours, with members raising concerns and offering suggestions. By day's end, a strategy had been approved. The cooperative would actively counter Montana Development Corporation's offers to neighboring ranches, extending its influence beyond Reed Valley's protected boundaries. As the meeting broke up, Marshall Winters arrived with information gleaned from his contacts in Helena. Montana Development Corporation is definitely Western Frontier rebranded, he confirmed, joining Eleanor in her office. "Same investors, new management structure. Harrison's the local face, but he reports to executives in Chicago." "What about their plans?" Eleanor asked. Winters handed her a folded document. "Land acquisition strategy for the next 3 years. My deputy copied it from Harrison's desk during a routine inspection." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Routine inspection?" Winters shrugged, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. "We take safety regulations very seriously these days." The document outlined precisely what Eleanor had feared: a systematic campaign to acquire key properties surrounding Reed Valley, effectively isolating the cooperative from expansion opportunities and controlling crucial access points. "They've learned from Grant's mistakes," Eleanor observed. "No illegal tactics, nothing that would attract federal attention, just methodical business maneuvers. Legal, but not necessarily ethical," Winters agreed, "and they're moving fast. Already purchased 2 properties along the northern watershed." Eleanor studied the map, calculating. "We need to secure the eastern corridor along the river. That's where the railroad's planning their new spur line." Her finger traced the properties marked for acquisition in Montana Development Strategy. One name stood out: the Davidson Ranch, a substantial operation that controlled nearly 5 miles of river frontage. "I need to speak with Jonathan Davidson," she decided. Today, the Davidson Ranch lay 20 miles east of cooperative headquarters, a prosperous operation with well-maintained buildings and extensive pasture land stretching toward the distant mountains. As Eleanor approached, she noted new construction, a large barn, and what appeared to be additional housing for ranch hands. Jonathan Davidson met her on the porch of his ranch house. In his early 40s, Davidson had a reputation as a shrewd businessman who had expanded his father's modest holdings into one of the territory's more successful independent operations. "Miss Parker," he greeted her with polite reserve. "This is an unexpected honor, the famous Eleanor Parker gracing my humble property." Eleanor detected a hint of sarcasm beneath the courtesy. "Mr. Davidson, your operation hardly qualifies as humble. I've always admired what you've built here." Davidson gestured toward the house. "Would you care for refreshments? My wife makes an excellent lemonade." The interior of the Davidson home revealed prosperity without ostentation. Quality furniture, family photographs, the comfortable atmosphere of a place where people lived rather than merely inhabited. Martha Davidson, a handsome woman with intelligent eyes, served lemonade before excusing herself, leaving Eleanor and Jonathan in the study. "I assume this isn't a social call," Davidson said once they were alone. "The Reed Valley Cooperative doesn't typically send its formidable leader to deliver pleasantries." Eleanor appreciated his directness. "You've been approached by Montana Development Corporation." It wasn't a question, but Davidson nodded confirmation. 2 days ago. "Generous offer for the river frontage portion of my property." Their western frontier, under a new name, Eleanor told him. Same organization that murdered Thomas Reed and tried to seize control of the entire region. Davidson's expression remained neutral. Ancient history, Miss Parker. 5 years is a lifetime in territorial politics. Besides, their representative assured me all leadership has changed. The faces have changed, Eleanor countered. The intentions haven't. She outlined what she knew of Montana development's strategy, explaining how Davidson's river frontage was a crucial piece in their plan to control access to the coming railroad spur. Davidson listened without interruption. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, studying her thoughtfully. Even if everything you say is true, Miss Parker, why should it concern me? I've been offered twice the market value for land that generates minimal profit. Because selling, to them, endangers every independent rancher in the territory, Eleanor replied, including the remaining portion of your own operation. They're piecing together a monopoly that will eventually dictate terms to everyone. Davidson's eyes narrowed. And joining your cooperative is different. How, exactly? It was a fair question, one Eleanor had anticipated. The cooperative exists to preserve independence through collective strength. Each member retains ownership of their land and operational control. We unite for contracts, infrastructure, and protection against precisely the type of consolidation Montana development represents. Pretty words, Davidson commented, but I've heard rumors that you rule the cooperative with an iron fist, that nothing happens in Reed Valley without Eleanor Parker's approval. Eleanor didn't flinch from the accusation. I founded the cooperative. From the ashes of Thomas Reed's ranch, I've guided its growth. But every major decision requires member approval, as outlined in our charter. She leaned forward slightly. I lead, Mr. Davidson. I don't rule. For a long moment, Davidson said nothing, simply studying her face as if searching for deception. Finally, he stood and walked to a cabinet, withdrawing a folder. Montana Development's offer, he said, handing it to Eleanor. Take a look. The terms were indeed generous, significantly above market value, with favorable conditions allowing Davidson to maintain operations on his remaining land for 5 years before a secondary purchase option activated. The river frontage is worth this much to them, because it's not about the land itself, Eleanor explained. It's about controlling access. Once they secure these key properties, they'll restrict crossing rights, charge exorbitant fees, effectively cutting off eastern expansion for operations like yours and mine. Davidson took back the folder, tapping it against his palm thoughtfully. What's your counteroffer, Miss Parker? Eleanor had come prepared. Cooperative membership. You retain full ownership, continue operating independently, but gain access to our contracts and infrastructure. Additionally, we'll purchase development rights to a corridor along the river, ensuring access remains open for all members. For considerably less than Montana Development is offering, I presume. For fair market value, Eleanor corrected, but with benefits that extend far beyond immediate payment. Davidson seemed unconvinced. I need time to consider both options. This isn't a decision to be made hastily. Of course, Eleanor agreed, rising to leave. But Montana Development won't wait long. Their strategy depends on quick acquisition before the opposition can organize. As she prepared to depart, Davidson walked her to her horse. You've built something impressive, Miss Parker. The cooperative, Reed Valley, it's not what anyone expected when Thomas Reed's mail-order bride decided to stay. Eleanor mounted her horse, looking down at Davidson. Perhaps that's because I never intended to simply be Thomas Reed's wife, Mr. Davidson. I came to build a life. Circumstances merely altered the foundation. Over the next weeks, the contest between the cooperative and Montana Development Corporation intensified. 3 smaller ranches north of Reed Valley sold to Harrison's company before Eleanor could even make counteroffers. But 2 others accepted cooperative membership, strengthening their eastern position. Jonathan Davidson remained non-committal, weighing both proposals, while Montana development increased pressure for a quick decision. Marshal Winters kept Eleanor informed of developments in Helena, where William Harrison was cultivating political connections with territorial officials, including several who would likely hold positions of influence when Montana achieved statehood. "They're playing a long game," Winters observed during one of his regular visits to the cooperative headquarters, building a foundation of political support that could eventually challenge Reed Valley's protected status. Eleanor had reached the same conclusion, which means we need our own political strategy. Montana's pushing hard for statehood. When it happens, having allies in the new state government will be crucial. "You thinking of running for office, Eleanor?" Winters asked, only half joking. Eleanor smiled slightly. "A woman in a territorial government? Perhaps Montana isn't quite that progressive yet." "Don't be so sure," Winters replied. "Your reputation extends well beyond Reed Valley these days. People respect what you've built, even those who don't always agree with your methods." Eleanor considered this. She had never viewed herself as a political figure, but Winters had a point. The cooperative's influence now extended throughout the territory. Perhaps it was time to leverage that influence in new directions. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A week later, Eleanor received a letter from the territorial governor inviting her to serve on a commission preparing recommendations for land management under statehood. The appointment would require frequent travel to Helena and consultation with both agricultural and industrial interests throughout Montana. Sullivan was skeptical when Eleanor shared the news. "Sounds like they're trying to keep you occupied while Montana development makes their moves." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged. "Or perhaps it's an opportunity to shape policy that will protect what we've built long after any of us are gone." Martha Davidson's unexpected visit the following day added another dimension to Eleanor's decision. Jonathan's wife arrived unannounced, asking to speak privately. "My husband is a proud man," Martha began, once they were alone in Eleanor's office. "Sometimes too proud to recognize when he's being manipulated." "Montana development?" Eleanor asked. Martha nodded. "They've been pressing hard for an answer. Yesterday, Harrison visited personally." She hesitated. There were veiled references to financial difficulties the Davidsons might face if they made the wrong choice. Eleanor's expression hardened. "They threatened you?" "Nothing so direct," Martha clarified, "just implications that the territorial bank might review certain loans unfavorably if Jonathan rejected their offer." The tactics were more subtle than Nathaniel Grant's direct intimidation, but the intent was identical. Pressure applied where it would be most effective. "What does Jonathan intend to do?" Eleanor asked. Martha sighed. "He's still weighing options. That's why I came. He respects you, Miss Parker, despite his attempts to suggest otherwise. If you spoke with him again—" Eleanor made a decision. "Tell your husband I'll meet him tomorrow at noon. Not here and not at your ranch. The fishing spot at Eagle Bend, where the river curves east." The meeting place Eleanor had chosen offered privacy and neutral ground, a bend in the river where locals sometimes fished, with a stand of cottonwoods providing shade against the summer heat. Eleanor arrived first, securing her horse and waiting beneath the trees. Davidson appeared precisely at noon, approaching with the cautious demeanor of a man uncertain of his reception. "Your wife visited me," Eleanor said without preamble as Davidson dismounted. "I know," he replied, surprising her. "It was my suggestion, though I let her believe it was her idea." Eleanor reassessed the man before her. "Clever." Davidson shrugged. "I needed to understand your reaction without the formality of another official meeting. Martha is an excellent judge of character." "And what did she conclude?" Eleanor asked, curious despite herself. "That you're exactly what you appear to be, formidable, principled, and committed to your vision for this territory." Davidson moved to stand beside her, looking out at the river. Harrison threatened my bank loans yesterday. Not explicitly, but the message was clear. Will you yield to the pressure? Eleanor asked directly. Davidson turned to face her. Would you? Eleanor smiled slightly. I think you know the answer to that. Yes, Davidson admitted. Your reputation for stubbornness is well established. He paused. I've decided to accept your offer, Miss Parker. The Davidson Ranch will join the cooperative. Relief washed through Eleanor, though she maintained her composed exterior. A wise decision, Mr. Davidson, for both our operations. There's one condition, Davidson added. I want a position on the cooperative's executive committee. If I'm joining this alliance, I intend to have a voice in its direction. Eleanor considered this briefly before nodding. Acceptable. Your experience would be valuable, particularly as we navigate Montana Development's political maneuvers. They shook hands, formalizing the agreement that would significantly strengthen the cooperative's position along the Eastern Corridor. Harrison won't take this well, Davidson observed as they prepared to leave. No, Eleanor agreed. He won't. Montana Development has now lost 3 key properties to the cooperative. They'll adapt their strategy accordingly. Becoming more aggressive, Davidson suggested. Eleanor shook her head. More subtle. Harrison isn't Grant. He understands that direct confrontation failed. He'll seek leverage elsewhere, political connections, financial pressure, perhaps even attempting to divide cooperative members against each other. And how will you counter that? Davidson asked, clearly testing her strategic thinking. Eleanor mounted her horse, looking down at her newest ally. By changing the battlefield entirely. The governor has appointed me to the Statehood Land Commission, Davidson whistled softly. Moving into politics, Miss Parker? That's unexpected. Not politics, Eleanor corrected. Policy. Montana will soon be a state. When that happens, the frameworks established now will determine the future for operations like ours. As Davidson mounted his own horse, a new respect showed in his expression. The mail-order bride who built an empire is now shaping a state. Thomas Reed would hardly recognize what his death set in motion. Eleanor glanced eastward, where the cooperative's lands stretched toward the horizon. Perhaps not, but I think he would approve of the legacy. They rode in different directions, Davidson toward his ranch, Eleanor back to the cooperative headquarters. Both understood that their alliance represented more than just a business arrangement. It was another step in the ongoing transformation of Montana territory from a lawless frontier to an ordered society where cooperation could triumph over exploitation. For Eleanor Parker, it was also a personal milestone, further evidence that the woman who had arrived 5 years earlier, seeking only the security of marriage, had instead discovered a capacity for leadership that had altered not just her own life, but the future of an entire region. Helena, Montana, November 8th, 1889. A crisp autumn day when history would be made. Crowds gathered outside the Territorial Capitol building, where the newly signed proclamation confirming Montana's statehood would soon be read. Among the distinguished guests on the platform stood Eleanor Parker, her hair now threaded with silver. At the temples, her bearing still commanding respect. As the territorial governor delivered his farewell address, Eleanor's mind drifted to the journey that had brought her to this moment. 10 years had passed since she'd stepped off that stagecoach to find Thomas Reed's grave instead of her promised husband. A decade of struggle, triumph, and transformation that had shaped not just her life, but the character of the new state itself. The fight against Montana Development Corporation had been protracted and complex. William Harrison had proven a more subtle adversary than Nathaniel Grant, working through political channels and financial manipulation rather than direct violence. But Eleanor's appointment to the Statehood Land Commission had given her the platform to ensure that the cooperative model pioneered in Reed Valley would be protected under state law. The governor's voice brought Eleanor back to the present as he introduced the special guests who had contributed to Montana's path to statehood. When he called her name, the applause was substantial, recognition of her influence extending far beyond Reed Valley. Miss Eleanor Parker, the governor announced, whose innovative approach to cooperative ranching has become a model studied by agricultural communities throughout the West. As Eleanor stepped forward to acknowledge the recognition, she caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, Marshal Caleb Winters, now serving as the county sheriff, his hair grayed, but his posture still straight. Beside him stood Dr. Samuel Wilson, retired from practice but still an active voice in community affairs. These allies from her earliest days in Montana had remained steadfast through all that followed. The ceremony concluded with the raising of the new state flag, its blue, veiled emblazoned with the motto Oro y Plata, gold and silver. But Eleanor knew Montana's true wealth lay in its land and the people who worked it, a perspective she had fought to instill in the state's founding documents. At the reception that followed, Eleanor found herself approached by a tall, distinguished man she recognized as Senator William Clark, one of Montana's newly appointed representatives to Congress. "Miss Parker," he greeted her, "your reputation precedes you. I understand the land use provisions in our state constitution bear your distinct influence." Eleanor smiled diplomatically. "I merely advocated for frameworks that would prevent monopolistic control of essential resources, Senator. Montana's future depends on balanced development that respects both progress and tradition." Clark studied her with newfound interest. "Washington could benefit from such practical wisdom. Have you considered a more formal role in government?" The suggestion was unexpected but not entirely surprising. Eleanor's prominence in territorial affairs had naturally led to speculation about her political ambitions in the new state. "My focus remains on the cooperative," she replied, "though I'm always willing to serve Montana's interests when called upon." As Clark moved on to greet other guests, Martha Davidson appeared at Eleanor's side. "Senator Clark seems impressed with you," Martha observed. "Jonathan says there's talk of appointing you to the State Agricultural Board." Eleanor nodded. "I've heard the rumors. It would mean more time away from Reed Valley." "The cooperative can manage," Martha assured her. "You've built something that functions even in your absence, the mark of a true leader." Later that evening, as the celebration continued, Eleanor slipped away from the crowded reception hall. She found a quiet balcony overlooking Helena's. Main Street now illuminated with lanterns commemorating statehood. Marshal Winters joined her there, offering a glass of champagne. "To Montana," he proposed, "and to the woman who helped shape it." Eleanor accepted the toast with a slight smile. "You give me too much credit, Caleb, and you take too little," he countered. "Look at what you've accomplished, Eleanor. Reed Valley spans 3 counties now. The cooperative includes 27 member ranches. You've established a framework that ensures independent operators can thrive alongside corporate interests." "We've established it," Eleanor corrected him. "I couldn't have done any of it alone." Winters studied her profile in the moonlight. "What would Thomas Reed think, I wonder, the man whose death brought you here?" Eleanor considered this question, as she often had over the years. "I think he'd be satisfied, not just with what I built from the ashes of his ranch, but with how Montana has developed. He wanted fairness, the chance for hard-working people to succeed on their merits rather than fall victim to those with greater resources." "That's his legacy, then," Winters observed, "through you." Eleanor gazed out at the city that had grown from the rough frontier town she'd first encountered. "Perhaps, though I prefer to think we created something new together. He provided the foundation, but the structure we built wasn't one he could have envisioned." The following morning, Eleanor rode out early from her Helena hotel, heading east toward Reed Valley. The journey would take most of the day, but she preferred horseback to the train when time permitted. It gave her an opportunity to observe the land directly, to witness the changes that statehood would inevitably accelerate. New settlements dotted the landscape that had been largely empty a decade earlier. Fenced pastures and ploughed fields indicated the territory's transition from open range to established agriculture. Progress, with all its complexity. By late afternoon, Eleanor reached the ridge overlooking Reed Valley. She reined in her horse, taking in the panorama below. The cooperative headquarters had grown into a small settlement of its own, with the main ranch house, administrative buildings, and housing for workers. Beyond stretched the carefully managed grasslands where cattle grazed, the lifeblood of the operation she had built from nothing. Near the horizon stood a simple stone monument that had replaced the wooden cross on Thomas Reed's grave, a more permanent marker for the man whose death had set everything in motion. As Eleanor descended toward home, she reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought her here. She had arrived as a mail-order bride, seeking security through marriage to a stranger. Instead, she had found purpose, community, and a strength within herself she'd never known existed. Montana's story as a state was just beginning. Eleanor Parker's role in that story would continue to evolve, moving beyond Reed Valley into the broader questions of how the new state would develop. But she would always return to this valley, to the empire she had built with her own hands from the ashes of tragedy. The mail-order bride had become a builder of worlds far greater than she had ever imagined. And Thomas Reed, the husband she never met, had given her not the conventional security she'd sought, but the opportunity to discover that she had never needed it at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.